Content warning. Graphic descriptions of sexual violence, torture, and child death. Imagine the sound of brick on brick closing your world forever. The scrape of a trowel, the steady, dull thud of mortar being pressed into place. Each small hammer strike a sentence in a verdict written in clay and lime. On a hot afternoon in 1875, in a farmhouse courtyard lined with jacaranda and coffee trees, a wealthy colonel ordered a wall to be raised. He did not order it to keep out weather or thieves. He ordered it to hide a secret, and to punish a daughter who had stepped beyond the strict boundaries of his honor. This is the case of Luía Ribeiro de Oliveira, the colonel's only child, of Manoel, a man enslaved to the house and to its economy, of Benedita, a lifelong servant whose voice would later break the silence, and of a small estate in Minas Gerais called Fazenda São Judas, where private violence became a public scandal. What unfolded within those plastered walls is one of the clearest, most terrible examples of how power and property intertwined in the Brazilian countryside, how a family's code of honor could justify brutality, and how the law of the land often failed those it promised to protect. If you want more investigations like this, subscribe and hit the bell. Fazenda São Judas sat among rolling hills, where coffee and cattle defined status as much as land itself. In 1875, Brazil still bore the structure of the empire: sugar and coffee barons, a rigid social order, and the slow but contested rumblings against the institution of slavery that would only be abolished nationally in 1888. In the provincial towns of Minas Gerais, the title colonial named more than a rank. It named social authority, political clout, a kind of unofficial justice. Coronel Joaquim Ribeiro de Oliveira was one such man, landowner, political actor, feared and deferred to by neighbors and by those who worked for him. He managed lives the way he managed fields, with planning, with force, and with an assumption of entitlement. Into this setting came Luía, 19 and raised under that exacting authority. She had spent years at a convent school, learned to read and to play the piano, learned the coded manners of a class that measured worth by chastity and public appearance. Behind a strict upbringing, however, beat a human heart, curious, isolated, and vulnerable to the kind of forbidden affection that grew between people who shared space but not status. Manoel had been part of the household for years. He polished boots, tended the pantry, moved through the rooms with a knowledge of corners and vulnerabilities that made him necessary, and dangerous in the eyes of those who thought of him only as property. He was described in accounts as steady, reliable, a man whose life was bound to the rhythms of the estate. Their connection was slow, private, and forbidden. What began as companionship became clandestine intimacy. The two tested the impossibility of relationship in a world built to forbid it. Then came the unmistakable evidence. Luía became pregnant. When the pregnancy was discovered, the plantation's equilibrium splintered. Secrecy could no longer hide the truth from the household's eyes. Honor, so carefully maintained in white tablecloths and visits from town notables, now required correction, or so the colonel declared. The father of the house, whose reputation justified his wrath, moved to punish. The responses to transgression on plantations were never merely private matters. They were performative, meant to reassert a social order. In this case, the colonel chose an act both symbolic and absolute. Manoel, accused of violating the master's daughter, was seized and publicly brutalized. The whip was not just a tool of physical pain, it was a language of warning. He was beaten until he could no longer stand. Then he was buried alive at the edge of the property, a punishment meant to erase and to terrify. It was an execution framed as discipline, carried out before eyes that would take the memory back into town. But the colonel's will did not stop at the field. He determined that Luía's shame must be hidden as well. A small room in the cellar, a windowless space below the household, used for storage and for duties the visible part of the estate could not show, was chosen. Workmen came with lime, with bricks, with mortar. They sealed the doorway. A narrow aperture was left, just enough for food to be passed through, small enough to ensure dependence and isolation. In the daylight hours, guests continued to come and go through the front doors of Fazenda São Judas. Downstairs, the rhythm of masonry smoothed over screams. The house kept its face to the world. What it hid in its belly would define the meaning of that facade for generations. What does it feel like to be walled in? We can only approach, imagining through the accounts, the sensations that Luía must have known. The chill at first, as the daylight narrowed, the red dust of mortar settling on her skin, the smell of lime, chemical, sharp, stinging her throat, the thud of mortar flattened into place above her head, as if her very breath was being covered. But alongside the physical terror, there must have been a fierce human resilience. She had been a daughter, not a supposed crime. She had a child growing within her as an unequivocal testament to life and to desire. In the dark, she would have felt that life like a heartbeat within a heartbeat, a small insistence against the cruel assertion that she should vanish. Benedita, a veteran house servant who had watched the family for decades, was a witness and a keeper of tiny mercies. She had seen the colonel's mood turn when the scandal threatened him. She had seen Manoel taken and left in the field. She had watched Luía carried like a bundle down the back stairs and locked away. The choices facing someone like Benedita were excruciating: speak and risk the wrath of the colonel, or stay silent and let the machine of power proceed. For a time the fear of reprisal held fast. But conscience and proximity have a way of pushing against fear. Benedita's endurance broke under the weight of what she could not allow to stand unspoken. As the days passed, the colonel's strategy was to make the punishment invisible but unmistakable. A small hatch was the only connection between the imprisoned woman and the world. Whoever supplied the food, and sometimes the colonel himself sent bread, treated the act as logistical, hygienic, necessary. The tiny hole communicated control. Who had the power to give? Who had the power to withhold? In the dark, Luía gave birth. The birth itself in that closed chamber is one of the hardest images to hold. There is no sanctified midwife in this account, no medical comfort of even basic care. There is the hand of Benedita, perhaps, pressed through the hatch, a scrap of cloth, the soft sound of a newborn's lungs struggling to adapt in a place whose air was stale and made for storage rather than for living. Imagine the smallness of a body that entered the world wrapped in cloth and in the same hands that had arranged the mortar that sealed a daughter's fate. Imagine the tenderness with which a mother, even in darkness, would cradle that child's pulse, the way love makes presence from absence. For some days the child cried. The mother named him in her head, perhaps, or spoke his name in whispers into the small hole, a place where affection could pass in words that were barely heard in the broader house. Those words were acts of resistance, but resources were limited, and the colony of cruelty around them allowed neglect to become the final sentence. Disease, cold, lack of nourishment, factors that the colonel and his household might have remedied easily, were denied. The infant weakened. One morning, perhaps, the noises stopped. How did the household reconcile this? Some turned away. Neighbors murmured that something had been done in the name of honor. Others pretended ignorance. The colonel kept his seat in the town council. His name did not vanish from the tax lists. When Benedita could no longer stomach her own complicity, she carried a truth she could not hide to Padre Antonio, the parish priest, known in the village for his articulation of mercy. She told him what she had seen. Manoel's burial at the earth edge, Luía walled in alive, the newborn who had breathed briefly in secret. A priest's role in 19th century Minas was complicated, a moral authority, but also part of a social fabric that often protected the statuses in which he lived. Nevertheless, Padre Antonio went beyond whispering. He pressed, he demanded, and he used the limits of his office to call for action. Breaking a wall is a drama in itself. The parish and a few officials, compelled by a priest and by Benedita's testimony, confronted the colonel with accusations. Stones were loosened. Lime fell in clouds. Light poured into the hollowed room like an accusing eye. What they found was a woman collapsed upon a bundle of rags and a child who no longer breathed. The physical body of Luía, rigid with shock and perhaps with the onset of fever and malnutrition, bore marks of confinement more than of active mutilation. Her expression, when recorded in later accounts, seemed more like the pallor of someone exiled in life than of a corpse. Eyes dim but not entirely blank, lips that could still form a plea if heard. What followed in public was less a pure search for justice than a negotiation of reputations. The colonel was arrested and brought to trial. the scene itself a rare and awkward public spectacle, a high-profile household under the stain of such an accusation. Yet the legal system of the time allowed privileges to those with rank and property. Reports from the period indicate that ultimately the colonel's punishment was light, a fine, some censuring words, and that the social scaffolding that protected men of his standing remained largely intact. Manoel, however, was already dead. His body returned to the soil in a manner that removed him from the possibility of testimony. The child would not have a chance at justice. Luía, though rescued from her wall, would not be restored. What does justice look like in a world where property shields criminals? A fine paid to a treasury does not bring back a life. A legal reprimand does not heal the body of one who has been kept in the dark for months. For those who watched, the spectacle of a trial may have eased the conscience of a town, allowing people to say they had done something. But the colonel's social life continued in ways that the law did not always touch. He would go on to show signs of decline. Accounts speak of a man haunted perhaps of remorse, perhaps of mercantile madness. But the public penalties never matched the scale of his acts. Luía survived the initial uncovering, but not without lasting damage. The months she spent in institutional care were marked by seclusion and treatment that rarely addressed psychological trauma. The language used in the records is telling: fragile, weakened, unfit for the social world she once occupied. She spent her remaining years under care, sometimes in private homes, sometimes in institutions, and she never fully returned to the life of music, letters, and social connection she had known. Her death years later closed the book on a personal tragedy that could have been resolved differently at any number of fateful moments, when suspicion was hushed, when a beat was not lifted, when a hatch was left open. If there is an architecture of memory, the manor at Fazenda São Judas became a witness in itself. Walls, floors, and dining rooms carry histories that linens can never fully conceal. Places that were built to project respectability kept their dark stories in basements and behind service doors. Later generations would walk the same corridors, perhaps unaware that the mortar in the cellar contained the residue of a woman's last months. Houses have ways of remembering crimes long after human witnesses have gone quiet. The cracks that appear in plaster are like thin mouths that eventually tell what was done. This story invites us to ask hard questions about power and silence. Who is protected when cruelty is done in private? How do social codes of honor become instruments of violence? And why do communities sometimes fail to match the moral urgency of tragic events with consequences proportionate to harm? The answer is never simple. It is tangled with economics, with status, with the fear of destabilizing a social order that benefits some while brutalizing others. Still, the facts we hold to be true, names preserved, testimony given by those like Benedita who risked everything to speak, records of trial and local gossip, let us see the contours of a pattern that continued across Brazil's plantation economy. We must also remember the human beings at the center of this. Luía, with a convent education and a tender heart. Manoel, a man whose labor sustained a household and whose life was cut short as if property could be returned to dust. Benedita, whose conscience compelled her to break silence. Padre Antonio, who used whatever moral authority he had to expose the truth. And the colonel, who exercised violent corrective measures in the name of honor. Each of them did not only enact roles in a story, they carried the textures of daily life, hunger, fear, affection, resentment, within them. To humanize the victims is not merely to feel compassion, it is to recognize how systems of power reduce human lives to problems for their owners. There is another layer to this, the law. Trials in provincial Brazil could be formalities or stages of moral theater. In this case, the legal outcome looms as insufficient. A fine cannot resuscitate a child. Public censure cannot restore a woman to her youth. Yet legal records do matter. They are the places where a story like this is written into official memory. The archives that preserve these proceedings are, ironically, how we know about the silence that once seemed so complete. I should note, for the sake of clarity, that the accounts of these events were recorded across the late 19th century. This version frames the incident in 1875 for narrative focus and to align with the case as it has circulated in the region's collective memory. How did neighbors and acquaintances respond to the scandal? The social ripples were subtle and revealing. Some withdrew, some rationalized, some used the event to fortify their own positions. A few letters and town records show that while the central family lost moral stature in certain circles, they retained economic power. The colonel's wealth continued to secure him respect in many quarters, and as the years passed, the memory of the incident softened in local conversation. Time, in that sense, became a partner to impunity. And yet the story did not vanish. It lived in whispered accounts, in the reluctance of servants to speak of certain corners of the household, in the way older women warned their daughters about certain dangers. Memory is tenacious. Architecture and gossip keep it alive. Benedita, whose testimony was crucial, left more than a legal legacy. She left a moral mark. She showed that the cost of silence can be higher than the cost of speaking. Her actions were an exception. In a community structured to protect the powerful, her courage is a reminder of how individual acts can pierce systemic protection. There are images that linger from this tragedy. The small hatch in the cellar, a child's rag doll left among the lime dust, the colonel's trembling hands as he paid an inadequate fine, the way a priest closed his eyes in prayer that could not mend a mother's grief. These images are not meant to titillate. They are meant to anchor us in what was concrete and human about the event. They demand that we refuse to let the violence be abstracted into mere statistics or social theory. The violence was up close, personal, and inflicted by people who believed they were maintaining order. What does this case mean for us now? First, it forces a confrontation with how systems of property and status can dehumanize. Slavery treated people as commodities. Patriarchal honor treated women as vessels of reputation. When both systems converge, the results can be catastrophic. Second, it highlights the limits of legal redress in environments where social power parallels legal authority. Reform and memory must move together. Laws alone will not suffice if the cultural frameworks that justify brutality remain unexamined. Third, it demands compassion for survivors like Luía, whose life after the wall was marked by loss and by a kind of social exile that lingered long after the physical lattice was broken. The memory of Fazenda São Judas today is not straightforward. The house, the trees, the fields carry histories that are both beautiful and brutal. As we look at the built environment of the past, we must ask what it keeps hidden. How many cellars hold untold stories? How many facades veil truths that would shake the foundations of community life if fully told? Memory work is a form of moral excavation. We take the tools of historical inquiry and pry open corners that were meant to be forgotten. We read parish records, trial notes, and the cautious testimony of those who dared to speak. We trace the echoes of these stories in local law and in the ways communities memorialize or fail to memorialize their pasts. No single narrative can capture the full anguish of what occurred, but by naming the people involved, by attending to the details that matter, the sound of mortar, the smell of lime, the smallness of a newborn hand, we give back a measure of dignity stolen by silence. We must also keep our indignation directed where it belongs, at the structures and decisions that allowed such an act to happen. The colonel exercised his power in ways that were all too ordinary for his world. For that reason, the story is not merely about one man's depravity, but about a social order that normalized such responses. We end with a simple and necessary commitment: to remember. To place a story like this into public knowledge is to insist that the past's violences be acknowledged, named, and held accountable in the way memory permits. It is to insist that architecture be read not only for its beauty, but for its moral tale. It is to say, as Benedita did with her trembling voice, that some truths must be told even when it costs. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and check the description for sources and suggested further reading. The archives, parish records, and local histories that preserve this case are the raw materials of memory. They are listed in the description so you can trace the evidence for yourself and learn more about the social context that allowed such tragedies to occur. Thank you for listening to this difficult tale. Remembering is an act of justice. Bearing witness is how we begin to keep power accountable and to honor those who could not speak for themselves.